Hey, what's it like to be a liberal in a conservative state or a fantasy writer who's also an English teacher at a time when books are being banned in some states? That's our guest today, so stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no holds barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people, some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now, here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
Terry Bartley is a journalism, literature, and English teacher at Scott High School in Madison, West Virginia, and writer of the upcoming collection of short stories, Tyranny of the Fae. Terry is the host of the podcast, Most Writers Are Fans, about the intersection between writing and fandom. He has professionally written for the Coal Valley News and Screenrant. He's won awards for writing and broadcasting from the West Virginia Associated Press, the National Broadcasting Society, and MarCom. Terry has a BA in English from the University of Phoenix and an MA in English Education from Western Governors University. Living in West Virginia, Terry is an unabashed liberal who worked for the Obama campaign in 2012. He's done a lot of community and economic development work in southern West Virginia as well. Hey, Terry, thanks for joining us on the Lean to the Left podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
You really got me when we were corresponding back and forth, and I sent you a question, well, what do you want on the show? And you said, one thing I'd really like to talk about is being a liberal in a conservative state. So now's your chance, pal. What's it like being a liberal in West Virginia?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things. In my life, I've done various different kinds of organizing work to try to figure out what exactly is going on in this state. And I think it's interesting to be somebody that's grown up here because you understand where a lot of the mentality comes from. I think that a lot of people view this state as very conservative, but a big part of that is that people don't have jobs and they just don't understand why everything is shifting away from how they've always lived their life. And as somebody who has always been more progressive, has always been trying to be more accepting and also reach beyond what we've always done, what we thought of as tradition. Because I live in Boone County, which is very much the coal fields of West Virginia.
Right.
And we think of coal mining as part of our culture, which it traditionally has been. But it's almost like people don't want to move past that because they're so stuck in the idea of this being who we are. And the idea of figuring out a different kind of economic way to move forward is blasphemy. And it has been for a long time. So I think that has been an interesting struggle of how can you economically succeed in an environment where the thing that we do is no longer profitable. I think that's honestly where a lot of the conservatism comes from in this state.
Is there a lot of fear about that, about the recognition that, hey, we need to adapt, times are changing, we need to adapt, but it's very scary? Is that an attitude or is it not that so much?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I remember whenever I first started working 5 or so years ago, I was doing a lot of economic development kind of stuff in the southern part of the state. And there was a lot of mentality of that, of very much if you talk about anything other than coal, they're what about coal? And our response was always what about coal? We're not taking it away. It's going away on its own without us. We just need other things to replace it. But I think that we have gotten to a place now where it is very much now that we don't have the coal jobs, now that they've already left, I think people are open to well, what else can we do? What else is there? And they're ready for anything, I think.
I have a frequent guest on my show. His name is Jack Kerfoot. He's a former oil industry executive who has really changed his focus, and he's now a big advocate for sustainable energy, wind, solar, and so on. And he talks a lot about the fact that coal is going away and it's going to go away even more. than it has in the past so far. He always says people who work in coal mines have the skills to work on offshore wind facilities, for example. Is that true, though? I mean, is it really practical to say, hey, man, you worked in a coal mine for 30 years. Now it's time to go get a job working on a wind farm somewhere? Really?
I think the thing that's hard for people to understand is just how much coal jobs paid here. Like people
Yeah,
here, like I knew people that made literally six figures as a coal miner, like not a
really.
supervisor, but as a coal miner. And that's like a huge
Wow.
salary for this area. And there just aren't
Sure.
jobs that replace that. So like whenever people say, like, oh, we're going to replace coal with this or with that, is not a one for one trade. So I mean, something like
Ah,
a wind farm, like I think they likely do have the skills to do it, but like it's not going to
yeah.
pay as well, and it just isn't.
Also, would require probably people uprooting themselves and moving somewhere else, too. How
And
many
that's
wind farms do
honestly
you have?
what's been happening a lot is like the reason like the coal jobs aren't coming back, and the truth is even if they would come back, it's not useful because a lot of the coal miners have already moved away to find other jobs.
Okay. What did you do for the Obama campaign?
Yeah, so I worked on the 2012 re-election campaign. At the time, I was working at a call center in Charleston, and I was doing like tech support stuff. I had applied to be a fellow for the Obama campaign. I'm just on a whim. Like I got an email from the campaign because I'd always been a Democrat, so I was just on the campaign emails, and I applied on a whim. I got the offer to be a fellow, and it was like a hard decision because being a fellow, you don't get paid anything. It was like a glorified internship. But I decided to do it because it felt like a once in a lifetime kind of opportunity to like travel and do these
Yeah,
different things. So I eventually
sure.
chose to do it. But then once I got there, I realized that I was as qualified as the other like field organizers, the paid staff. So I
Mhm.
quickly applied to be one of those. I got it like within a week, and I was a field organizer in Parma, Ohio, like right outside of Cleveland. And I did that for 3 4 months.
Okay. Was that an experience that you count as a important part of your background now?
Yeah, I think it's the thing that I think back on, and it feels like one of my biggest accomplishments because I had a
Uh,
hand, how small or how big, I don't know, but I had a hand in electing a president of the United States. I did a lot of like volunteer organizing, and I got to see a lot of really passionate people like do this work for somebody that they believed in. And I think that what
mhm.
really changed in my head when working for the campaign is this idea that I don't want to do a job just for the sake of getting paid. I want to do a job like to help people and to do things that are like worth it. Like I want to be fulfilled in the job that I work. And I think that it's been a thing I've really had some struggle with after that because it's hard to find a job quite as impactful as a presidential campaign.
You mentioned a minute ago that you did some community and economic development work in southern West Virginia. Exactly what did you do, and what
Yeah,
did
so I worked
that?
for this organization called the West Virginia Community Development Hub. We did
Yeah.
what they call community development, which is we go in and we get volunteers together. We build like volunteer teams, and we would
Uh-huh.
help them. They would each pick an economic sector that they wanted to work towards, and then those teams would then develop those sectors. And essentially, we were just finding different options to increase the economy of the areas. So, like, we'd have like a tourism
Nice.
team that would work to like open up different tourism opportunities and identify like what they needed to flush out that industry. We'd have
Mhm.
teams that would work on like energy, and they would try to figure out where are some other energy jobs that they could pursue, or like tech, and like what kind of tech businesses could they open, so that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of really just getting people empowered to feel like they had some hand in their future. Because I think that when you live somewhere like here, a lot of times you feel like you have no control over your life because a lot of your life is determined by your geography. And I think that a lot of what we did with that job was tell people that they do have some say in it. Like they have some power in determining what happens in their area.
Yeah, and I mentioned that is really important, and especially in an area like that. You're a fantasy writer, Terry, and when I read that part of your resume. I just wondered if it's a fantasy to think that Joe Manchin will ever vote like a Democrat.
Yeah. So to
and
answer your
and
question,
and
I think that
yeah,
he does 90% of the time. He votes for Biden's judges. He votes for administration officials. Like he votes with the Democrats 90% of the time.
yeah,
It's just the
but
really,
when
really
they,
important issues that he doesn't vote for, right?
yeah, that's right. That's right. It's the really important ones that he sometimes doesn't, and drives the rest of the Democratic Party freaking nuts. And what about him? Is he in a real strong position? Is he vulnerable? Is he going to run for president? What do you know?
I feel like you can make a career out of trying to predict what Joe Manchin is going to do because you're never going to be right.
Yeah,
It's hard to
yeah.
understand his logic ever. But
Uh,
I like to think that he often believes the things he says, whether or not
he
it makes any
often
sense.
believes the things
Whether or not
he
it makes
finds.
any sense doesn't always fit. Like, I believe that
Right.
he actually does care about the deficit. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I don't know why he thinks
Yeah.
that matters, but I think he really does
Right.
care about it. And nobody's ever accused Joe Manchin of making sense. So I don't think I should start now.
What about his constituents? Do they care about the deficit?
I think
Really?
they're supposed to, yeah, because I think that a lot of West Virginians are a lot of retired individuals, because that's a lot of who's still here,
Sure.
right? And I think that a lot of those people have that like Reaganomics mentality to it, where it's bring
Yeah.
the deficit down and the economy will turn around. I don't think they really understand the logistics of it because they were told years ago. And honestly, just to dig into this for a second, I think that a lot of people in West Virginia have been manipulated for so long by politicians, by corporations, that they just don't know what to believe anymore, but they believe the things that
Uh-huh.
they were told like 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I think that still
Right.
informs the way that they vote now.
Yeah, I imagine that's true. All right. Let's talk a little bit about your podcast. Tell me what it's all about.
The idea is I invite other writers on, and where I'm a writer, we talk about like their writing journey and like what got them into it. And then I use the term writer very broadly. So I also talk to like game designers and musicians, like songwriters, things like that, because I feel
Mm-hmm.
like there's a lot of overlap in any kind of writing. So we
Okay.
talk about what they got it, like what draws them to it. Because if you're a writer, for some reason you feel like the story you have to tell, like other people want to read. So we do a
Yeah.
lot of what drew you to that, what made you feel that way. And then
Mm-hmm.
we also talk a lot about like different topics and different tropes and genres also. So it's really just a bit of back and forth of, oh, you write this way. I also did that in my writing. And we do a bit of, we relate to each other. And I think it's a good podcast. What it has evolved into is a good podcast for other like indie creatives to learn about like how to promote, how to grow, things like that. Because we do a lot of nitty gritty dig into what kind of marketing do you do? What is it like to go to cons by yourself and carry boxes of your own books? Like, how is that different than if you have the support of a bigger publisher? And that has been kind of
Yeah,
interesting to dig into
exactly.
that.
That sounds interesting. You guys check it out if you're interested in writing and want to hear about that kind of thing. I think it sounds like an interesting thing. And so then that brings us to your book. You mentioned in some material you sent me something about colonization and institutional oppression, which prompted you to write your book. And I need to understand what that is.
Yeah. So I think within the past, like, especially like post COVID, whenever the big Black Lives Matter stuff happened over that summer, not that was new,
Mm-hmm.
but it was whenever it really got into the mainstream. I think that we really started as a country reckoning with this idea of institutional oppression. And like what I think about a lot is there's this neighborhood in Charleston, which is the capital of West Virginia. It's the west side of Charleston. People often will talk about how much crime is there. And it's just like a thing that people say, and they've said
Mm-hmm.
it for a long time. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I
Mm-hmm.
realized that the crime there statistically isn't actually that much more than in any other part of Charleston. There's just a lot of black people that live there. And it's a thing that I didn't realize that it was so built into, like, the racism was so institutional that we didn't even realize we were perpetuating it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So that brings up a whole bunch of questions about things like police reform in Charleston, in your area. Are there issues where people are being abused by the cops when they get arrested if they happen to be African American? You're having those kinds of problems?
You don't hear about it a ton here, and I think that
No.
it's just because our black population is pretty small comparatively to in other
Okay.
areas.
Okay.
That's not to say it doesn't happen. I think that you just don't hear about it
Sure.
as much. And I think that it's a thing. There's this thing that happens in this state that I've noticed, especially in my area, where, like, in Boone County where I live, there's maybe 4 to 5 black families that live here, and that's not even an exaggeration. It's probably just legitimate. And people
Really?
tend to say, I'm not racist because, like, I know these people, but then they talk about how, like, they're our black people. You know what I'm saying? They talk about them how, like, they're different because they're ours. Like, they're our friends. And I
Right.
don't think they realize that is racist to say these black people are good. They're not like these other black
Yeah.
people. And I think that and I don't even think that it's malicious, like, in intent. Like, they're trying to say a compliment to these other people. But I think that they don't really see that it's, like, harmful broadly.
I live in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And of course, which I also am a liberal in a red state, just as you are. And I think that probably South Carolina might even be worse than West Virginia in a lot of ways. Anyway, there was this guy, African American guy, who was the chair of the local Democratic Party here. And I got to be good friends with him. I was doing a bunch of work with them. And one day, I don't know, we were having this conversation and we were talking about racism. And I made some comment like, I'm the least racist guy. And I started saying something like that. And he stopped me and he looked at me, please don't say that. And then I caught myself and I thought, that really is a dumb thing to be telling this guy. And I think I put him off and I didn't mean to. I was trying to be positive, but he took it the wrong way. He took it the opposite way. And coming from his standpoint, I could see that.
Yeah, I think the thing that
Anyway,
we've learned over the past few years is that to not be racist is actually, like, acknowledging that you are racist in a lot of ways that you don't see. And
there's stuff that, yeah, there's stuff that was built into your psyche when you were a little kid, I think.
yeah, and I
And
think that you're gonna mess up still. Like, we all are. But I think that being able
yeah,
to, like, listen whenever people say this is wrong that you did this thing, and then understand
right,
why, and then learn from it. I think that's what
yeah,
being not racist actually is, like, being able to listen.
you're right. And that's one reason why I focus my podcast on social issues, including racism, sexism, and other types of prejudicial attitudes. I don't know. I just think that if we talk about things like this and try to work together and overcome some of these attitudes, I just think that's a positive thing. And that's what I'm trying to do. So,
Yeah, I'm a queer person that lives in a very red state, right? That's not always easy. And
yeah, it's
I
not.
sort of have to navigate this world accepting that people are going to say things that are going to be offensive to me sometimes. And I
Yeah,
think that sort of
that's
learning to pick your battles and to not always correct
yeah,
people when it might not be
yeah,
safe. But whenever you do
yeah,
trust somebody, like, doing it, like, I think that our
yeah.
responsibility as allies, like, to like people of color, is just make ourselves people that they feel comfortable correcting. You know, making ourselves people that they feel like they can trust and not be, like, in danger by talking to us about this stuff.
Yeah, tell me about your book that you're working on. It's coming out in August, I think you said,
Yeah. So
right?
Tyranny of the Fae is a collection of short stories set in the same fantasy world. It stars 3 of queer women, all of which have different love stories and different, sort of written in different ways in the book. And they're also like looking for adventure, like looking for ways to break out of their life in again, very different ways that they want to do that they accomplish that. I think that honestly speaks a lot to, they always get it right. And as being somebody that's lived in West Virginia, especially like very rural West Virginia for much of my life, I've always been looking for that adventure, looking for that thing that I can break out and find something new and different to do. So I think that this will speak to a lot of people that have similar backgrounds to me, that have always felt like maybe they didn't quite fit in where they lived, and they want to try to find the people, they want to find their people, find the people that they can connect with.
Where'd the name come from?
A couple of different places. So fays are like really hot right now in fantasy. So I wanted to chase that trend a little bit. But also the fae tends to talk about like elves and things like that. The elves in my world are the colonizers. Like, it's a different realm. They're having a magical energy crisis to kind of like play on what we're experiencing right now. And they have to find somewhere else to go to. So they find a super magical world full of various kinds of indigenous peoples. And they choose to invade and colonize this world. And then, so that's part of the story, is that happening. But then we pick up mostly a couple hundred years later, where we see the impacts of that, where the elves have then left, but then they've still touched every aspect of culture. The language that they speak is Elven, like where we speak English because the British colonized where we live. So that's how it's been interesting to play on. What would a magical world be like if the things that happened in our world happened there?
You have quite an imagination, don't you?
If you think about it, it's a play on our world, so I don't know how creative it is.
Okay. So the book's coming out in August. People can find it where? On Amazon and so on?
Yeah, it's for pre-order now. You can pre-order it in any independent bookstore that distributes with Ingram, which is like the main indie bookstore distributor. But it is also on Amazon. It's also on any other website. The audiobook is being recorded now. That'll be available on Audible and Apple soon.
Oh, it's being recorded now?
Yeah.
So the book is done then?
The book is, yeah. The book has been finished for a couple months now.
Okay. All right. Okay, so you guys watch for it. It's coming out in August, and I know I'm going to check it out. Let's see here. I wanted to talk a little bit of politics. Can we talk a little politics?
Sure.
What are your thoughts about DeSantis and others that are trying to restrict books that can be carried in school and courses that can be taught in school? What are your thoughts about
I don't like it, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of it.
Yeah.
I think that as an English teacher, the way that I often think of my job, like what my responsibility as a teacher, is to expose kids to books that they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. So I try to make sure that they read books by not just like other white authors, because it'd be easy as an English teacher to just have books by white men all the time, right? Because there's so many in the English canon. But I always try to make a real effort to include books with people of color and people that are queer and like all these kinds of different cultures and stuff. Right. It is frustrating to think about teachers in Florida that don't have that possibility now. Like the African American histories classes just not existing anymore. That's horrifying. Yeah. Because like you're just saying we don't need to hear these other voices. And like, how are we ever going to be a cohesive society if we're not going to listen to half of the country?
Yeah. The guy seems to be picking up, I shouldn't say that, he's not really picking up steam that much, but the whole idea of restricting what can be taught in school, trying to, I don't know, I think hide some of the things that occurred over the years, the racist ways people have been treated, and some of the bad things that have taken place in recent history in the United States. He can't sweep those under the rug. They happened. People need to understand that they happened. They need to understand why they happened, right?
Yeah. Whenever the Jewish community always says about World War II, never forget, right? Never forget the Holocaust. We can learn from it so it'll never happen again. If we forget
Yeah.
about slavery, we forget about racism, we forget about civil rights, then it's going to happen again, right? We're going to start oppressing people again. So I think that we have to remember these parts of our history so we can learn from it. And then also on top of that, we talk about oppression and oppressed voices. Like, you just have to let other people talk. You can't listen if you don't let them say anything, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the real danger here is we're pretending like other people, as specifically other like non-straight, non-white people, non-cis, don't exist. And that's just naive, right? Because they do exist. And I think that sort of like telling kids, like, if you try to convince them that trans people don't exist and therefore they won't be trans, then all you're doing is just making it more dangerous for the kids that are trans. And then you make the world more confusing for the kids that aren't. Like, they always say, you don't want to confuse kids by telling them about trans people. But isn't it more confusing for them to have a trans uncle that they don't know why or what's going on with that?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. In West Virginia, is it Trump or DeSantis or somebody else?
Honestly, I feel like in West Virginia, there's a lot of people that don't really know who DeSantis is yet. Because I think that in West Virginia is a lot of these like lower engaged voters who like they vote because that's how everybody else is voting. I think there's a lot of, I think this person will win, so I'll vote for them. Like, that mentality is pretty heavy here. And honestly, I think that Trump spoke to people here because he did that thing where he seemed unconventional and he seemed like he says the things that people aren't saying. The thing that people always said, like, he says the same thing other people are thinking. I feel like DeSantis is trying to be more institutional, like he's trying to be more of a traditional Republican. And I don't know if that's going to work here. Because the truth is, somebody like Joe Manchin, who feels very right-leaning, right, when you think about him, he always calls himself a West Virginia Democrat, which I don't think he ever explains what that means. But I remember here in this state, whenever the Republicans took over the state legislature, they were like, oh, we're going to clean up the budget. We're going to make so many tax cuts and so many cuts to like spending so that things will change, be more conservative. Then they were like, oh, we can't do anything because the Democrats already cut spending so low that there's nothing left to cut. Because Democrats in West Virginia have always been pretty conservative. So I think that the reason that a lot of Democrats are switching to Republicans aren't because they, like, their ideologies changed that much. Just the parties have flipped, or the values have always been more conservative here.
Yeah, but the Republican Party isn't anywhere near what it used to be. I mean, they're...
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's... I also think that there's this mentality, not just in West Virginia, but like anywhere like West Virginia, any sort of more rural area, that the world is changing very fast, right? Like because you think about the fact that gay marriage was legalized like 15 years ago, something like that, and we're already talking about like transgender rights, which granted we should have been a long time ago. But I think that if you didn't even think about gay people existing 15, 20 years ago, like, it feels like a rapid change, right? And I think that for those people, it's just jarring that the world around them is changing. And I think that it's just a little scary for them. And I think that that's what is institutional, like, racism, institutional homophobia really is, this fear of change and not understanding things.
Yeah. Hey, if Trump gets convicted of one of these various crimes that he's accused of in these various court cases that are currently going on, would he still carry, and if he's even sent to prison, would he still carry West Virginia, do you think?
I think so. Because I talked a lot about how politicians and corporations manipulated the area. I think if people used to say, I support coal, as though that means literally anything. And people would get votes for it. And Trump has said, I support coal on stage in front of people in West Virginia. So I think they just have their vote.
Okay. So coal is still like the dominant factor in West Virginia.
Because it's a lot of retired coal miners that live here still. So they think that it
Yeah.
matters when it doesn't.
Yeah. But aren't there a lot of really religious types in West Virginia, and especially in the Republican Party?
I think that like the idea of being a Christian being like a strong value that matters here, I think does matter. But I
Yeah.
think that it is almost secondary to why people vote. I remember growing up, my family went to Church of Christ. We were very conservative in the way that we worshiped. I remember
Mhm.
going out in church and seeing like those cards on windshields about these are the anti-abortion candidates, so vote for them down the ticket, which at that point didn't matter that much because a lot of people voted Democrat back then, straight ticket. But I think that kind of thing has become more pervasive as time has gone by.
Yeah. Okay. I just wondered, I don't understand how, if you are a religious person who believes in the Ten Commandments, let's just say, how can you possibly support Donald Trump?
My mom, who is relatively conservative, often
Yeah.
tells me she doesn't understand why people support Trump because like the way he talks as president was
Yeah.
so like
Yeah.
not normal and aggressive
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
unkind, and those things
Yeah.
seemed very unchristian to her. And I think that a lot of people see that, but I think that there is another
Mhm.
side of people who care less about that and just think it's fun to have this guy that's silly in the White House.
And I guess they you know what, I tell the story a lot. When I first moved here to South Carolina from Maryland, I wanted to play senior softball. And so I went out and I joined up with this team, and most of the players were guys who have lived here for a long time. Some are natives of this area. And it was right after Trump won the election, the day after I went to play ball. And I overheard some conversations. And basically, it was now we can say and do just about anything we want to because of Trump.
Yeah.
And that had to do with mostly racist attitudes and comments, and also LGBTQ issues as
And even beyond that, I mean, I remember hearing
just,
people say
you
things
know,
like, now we can say Merry Christmas. And it's like, who was stopping you before? Did somebody tell you you couldn't?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I had a hard time with it and ended up pulling away from that team. There were some other reasons as well, but mostly it was, I just didn't like being around those kinds of attitudes. So anyway, so what else? Anything else we need to talk about?
I could talk about this stuff all day. So I've appreciated the opportunity for sure to talk about this stuff because as a writer, a lot of the podcasts I go on talk about like my writing and my books. And this is something that is really important to me is like the politics of it. And also just like
Right.
growing up where I live and to try to make people understand it a little better. Because there was this real interest after Trump was elected into the people of Appalachia and to understand who they are and what they do. And I feel like a lot of people were more interested in like, why did they vote for Trump specifically, as opposed to what got them to there. So I think that talking about that has been really great for
I hope
me.
you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you learned something as well. Please come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. And you can check out the schedule of upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. You can also subscribe to our audio version there or to our video shows here at YouTube. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at BobGaddy_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we and our guests comment on the latest developments in the news and about the social issues that concern us all. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.